Welcome to NABA Perspectives, a podcast by the Norwegian-African Business Association, or NABA, where we look at key trends, stories, and issues that are driving economy, policy, and business across Africa. I'm Razia Khan, the head of content at NABA, and this week we're going to be talking about Tanzania. In February, Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan will be conducting an official state visit to Norway. In conjunction with that, NABA will be hosting a business forum looking at opportunities in Tanzania. And ahead of that, I sat down with Razia Khan, head of research for Africa and the Middle East at Standard Chartered, and Sarah Baynton-Glen, an economist also with Standard Chartered. We discussed what is driving growth in Tanzania, some of the challenges Tanzania's economy faces, and above all, why Tanzania is an economy that should be of interest to investors. Razia and Sarah, thanks so much for joining the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for inviting us.
Right, so let's get right into it. And let's start with the big picture, and then maybe we can zoom in a little bit more and talk more specifically about events in Tanzania. We know that in 2024, the global outlook continues to be plagued by all sorts of uncertainties, whether it's on persistent risks or concerns about a recession. We have a definite slowdown in the Eurozone. We have a slowdown in China. We obviously have all sorts of concerns around stability and security for reasons that we're all very well aware of. Africa, of course, is not immune to this. Tanzania as an economy is not immune to this. So to kick off the discussion, could I just throw out there, what does the global picture mean for Tanzania? What's the best way to approach the question of the outlook for an economy like Tanzania in light of the global context? Razia, maybe you want to start us off.
Thank you, Lanre. So a few things that everyone seems to be focusing on is obviously we've come out of this period of unprecedented in recent memory speed of monetary tightening. Developed markets came out of the COVID crisis with stronger than expected recoveries, and one of the consequences of that was much more inflation, perhaps inflation higher on a structural basis than anyone had anticipated. Not only did we have the pressures associated with the Russia-Ukraine war, global food prices, global energy prices rising, and this adding to the considerable pressure in African countries more broadly, let's not forget the sequencing of that recovery. Many African countries were still only very gradually coming out of the COVID crisis. Now, there had been a milder impact on Tanzania's economy for reasons that my colleague Sarah will be talking about in great detail. But it's fair to say that for the Africa region, there have been significant global headwinds. Not only is there the uncertainty now, all of that monetary tightening, the expectation is that history repeats itself. This is going to lead to a slowdown in economic growth, even though a lot of growth indicators seem to have been holding up so far. And the concern is that if we look back at the record of African growth, that sort of global backdrop has never been great for outcomes in the region. We know that there has been a fairly strong, consistent relationship between global economic outcomes and African growth. Many African economies, being commodity dependent or tourism dependent, will feel the impact of global developments with a significant lag. So, as we look to the eventual impact of monetary tightening in many developed economies, as we look to China trying to revive growth with perhaps a less investment heavy growth model, there's a great deal of uncertainty there. And what is unproven when it comes to African economic growth, it's the ability of individual economies to try to buck that trend. Now, Tanzania does stand out for a number of reasons. And we know that part of this is the expectation that relative to a lot of its regional counterparts, it's going to be experiencing more significant economic growth, that we are seeing a stronger, firmer growth trend in a a way, this is just a revival of what we had been accustomed to in Tanzania before those years of country specific policy that perhaps changed the growth outcomes that were achievable by an economy like Tanzania. Not so long ago, it was seen as a fairly diverse economy, benefiting from tourism, benefiting from mining, coming out of a relatively low base, easily achieving 7% growth because of the demographics driving the growth experience in Tanzania. And of course, it was very strongly donor supported. Then we saw the years under President Magufuli, much more tightness in policy, a focus that perhaps took away from that growth environment, which now seems to be back. But the key question, the uncertainty is, how is this going to be sustained going forward? Obviously, there are a number of factors that we'll touch on. My colleague Sarah will talk about the gas related developments in particular, possibly the most promising for the outlook for the economy.
Great, thank you, Razia. You've already touched on a myriad of issues that we can unpack a bit more at this point. Sarah, is there anything you want to add to that before we maybe dig into some of those issues in more depth?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe in terms of some of the implications that we've seen for Tanzania more specifically over the past few years, clearly Tanzania hasn't been immune to some of those global factors, that the main ones being the rise in oil and food prices over the past few years, with Tanzania being quite a significant oil importer in particular. But we are still very positive on the outlook going forwards. We've seen quite a degree of resilience over the past few years to some of those disruptions that we've seen from a global perspective, and clearly some of those trends around LNG, as well as a much more positive business environment that we've seen over the past few years, are going to be key for the outlook, and I'm sure we can delve into those in a bit more detail as well.
Yeah, so according to the IMF, the expected growth for Tanzania is 6.1% this year, which is pretty solid by any measure. It's one of the standout performers, not just in East Africa but across Africa. And Razia, you've already alluded to this, but we of course had this change of government in 2021 when we moved from John Magufuli to President Samia Suluhu Hassan. How important has that been in, as you said, kind of in a way putting Tanzania back on track?
It seems to have been the very key factor, Lanre, looking at what domestic investor sentiment had been previously. Of course, President Magufuli voted in a very strong focus on trying to achieve different governance outcomes, but the unintended consequence of that was a tightening of the environment. Businesses that had long been operating in Tanzania felt that that was perhaps a less private sector friendly environment, that the approach of the government was somewhat too heavy handed when it came to driving up tax revenue mobilization, when it came to increased compliance with a lot of the taxation regime. And also, what was crucially missing in those years was any focus on some of the longer term potential, especially the offshore gas development. There had been a great deal of optimism across a lot of the East Africa region regarding the potential for resource strength, but very little that was done about it during President Magufuli's term. So, yes, the political shift in Tanzania has been key to this different outcome. The expectation that we're going to see much more focus, as we're already starting to get a sense of, attracting investment from the rest of the world, reviving that interest in the LNG potential of the economy, really looking to what could be driving the building blocks for future growth in the economy. But what has changed most significantly, perhaps, is the sense that there is a different policy environment in place, one that lends itself perhaps that much more easily to achieving those natural growth outcomes. Because let's not forget that for a long period in its history, Tanzania was turning out headline rates of growth of around 7% a year, almost an autopilot. Nonetheless, there's still an issue with that. And the key issue was that not all of the population felt that that growth was necessarily inclusive. It was driven by bigger developments, mining in the early 2000s, Of course, there was a relatively diverse story to it, but also this sense that growth could have been much more meaningful, much more inclusive. This is an issue for many different African economies. With offshore gas and the potential developments around that, it's very plausible that Tanzania will be able to sustain the kind of growth rate that sees it doubling in size over the next decade. This is not at all out of reach. But the key question is, how do you translate that headline growth rate, especially if it's dependent on resource related developments, and turn it into something that feels more meaningful, more inclusive to Tanzania's population?
Are we seeing that happening?
On this, I'll defer to Sarah to add her thoughts on this issue.
I think the key thing that we're watching for going forwards is how the LNG revenues are managed. So clearly the expectation at the moment is that we could get final investment decision in 2025, potentially production from the 2030s, and how those resources are managed, how that is spent on social spending or other expenditure as well going forwards is really going to be key. I do think, however, as well, that in terms of the growth outlook for this year, the positive for Tanzania is that the drivers are quite diverse. So we've seen a big focus on agriculture over the past few years. So policy being driven towards encouraging lending towards agriculture in particular, and as well as the mining sector, clearly a lot of progress in terms of construction with rail links also being a key focus. So the diversity of the growth picture is going to be key, and it's going to be key to that resilience, and also in terms of that feeding through to different sectors of the population, whether that be through employment or government expenditure as well.
Now, the LNG story is one that's been a long time coming. It's been in the works for quite a while. Sorry, you just said that we might be heading for a final investment decision in 2025. Presumably that means 2024 is kind of an important year in moving us in that direction. What's your take on what might happen in terms of the LNG development, which of course, if successful, will in one way or the other transform Tanzania's economy? The question, of course, is how it plays out in the long term. But over the next 12 months or so, what are some of the key things that we should be looking at and following?
So I think the key thing that we're watching for in the near term is host government agreement. So that is expected to be quite imminent. That's the next stage before we get to final investment decision, hopefully in the first half of this year. So that's probably the key thing to watch for. But I think also interestingly, in terms of the LNG trends, is the trends that it's pointing towards in terms of Tanzania's relations with other parts of the world as well, because we've seen a lot of interest from European investors and European countries in securing future LNG for their use, as well as beyond that. Actually, Tanzania probably stands apart within the region as being one of the countries that hasn't borrowed a lot from the likes of China and other countries bilaterally in the past. So we're seeing a big shift in terms of relationships, both with Europe, purely driven as well, and to some extent by the LNG developments, but also a diversification of where Tanzania is getting its borrowing from as well.
In terms of energy and moving away from LNG for a minute, one of the big themes that we're seeing coming through, of course, is the energy transition, and the more of a focus on investment into renewable energy across Africa, and Tanzania is no exception. There are ambitions to ramp that up significantly. How would you assess the state of the environment in terms of renewable energy investment? Is it significant? Could 2024 be an important year in terms of seeing more money going into that and more projects being either originated, initiated, or developed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a key focus, and not just obviously in Tanzania, but elsewhere in the region as well. Much more in terms of the renewable energy mix and Tanzania's role within the transition as well, obviously being driven by those LNG developments. So renewables being a key focus, I think, still going forwards as well.
So quick, I want to move on, but quick to the fiscal picture. And Razia, you mentioned the issue of monetary tightening, which of course has a very direct knock-on effect on many African economies, and we've seen that play out in many economies. The big issue for many is debt, and debt service payments in particular. And in very simplistic terms, when interest rates go up, when the Fed hikes its rates, dollar-denominated debt, of which African economies have quite a lot, becomes more expensive. It seems to me that Tanzania is not one of those countries that has that's really in trouble in that respect. We've seen some places like we've seen a default in Ghana, we've seen obviously a default in Zambia, Ethiopia has defaulted. There are nerves about where Kenya is going to be in 2024 with its Eurobond maturing in the summer. Where's Tanzania sit in terms of debt, but the overall fiscal picture as well?
So, two sides to this, Lanre. And Tanzania, in a sense, has almost benefited inadvertently from its history. There had been a private placement of debt very early on. When many African countries were finding that access to global markets was opening up. But Tanzania was probably excluded from that rush post global financial crisis to issue Eurobond after Eurobond. This does seem to have been something that tripped up many of its counterparts when it came to managing their debt service obligations. As my colleague Sarah pointed out, it hadn't necessarily been borrowing very significantly from large official bilateral creditors like China. It's not seen as one of those economies with particularly significant exposure historically. And it had a strategy of using concessional sources of financing where those concessional sources of financing were open to it. That said, there are still significant fiscal hurdles that the economy needs to contend with. If we take a step back and look at this big picture, Tanzania in the 1990s, undergoing that transition from its socialist past to a future economic path that was much more driven by private sector activity, the economic transformation that was taking place, not just in Tanzania, but to some extent in many other African economies at the same time. What ended up happening in Tanzania was that large, visible, state owned enterprises, dating back from the days when economic activity was much more state driven, suddenly were not there any longer. And this was reflected in a significant deterioration in Tanzania's revenue mobilization ratios. Now, effort after effort by successive Tanzanian governments enjoying the benefits of what became a pretty robust growth rate from the early 2000s, still an ongoing effort to try to compensate for the absence of those large, visible, state owned enterprises that had contributed to much more formal sector activity in the past. Through that transition and the broadening out of the economy, it just wasn't that easy for Tanzania to raise revenue ratios to the extent that was required. And that may well have been a factor in the issue that we now see where Tanzania did not succumb to the same extent of external borrowing as many of its counterparts, but it remains a key constraint on the outlook for the economy unless we can see further reforms, a further deepening of reform that really addresses this issue of revenue mobilization. Question marks remain as to the effectiveness of the state in delivering a lot of the developmental goals. The unfortunate tendency would be for an economy like Tanzania to become overly reliant on resource driven revenue in the future without necessarily having resolved that issue of its revenue base at the outset, not really tapping into the avenues that can drive a sustainable amount of revenue mobilization from the non resource sector. Now, none of this is going to be resolved overnight, and my colleague Sarah can talk about expectations of the Tanzania budget, where the policy focus is right now. But we shouldn't forget that this is the big picture issue that does loom in the background.
Absolutely. Sarah, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Razia, the the revenue picture is really a key focus for the government and under its IMF program as well, where clearly that's one of the key areas where the IMF is looking for progress over the course of the program. So revenue collection at the moment extremely weak, even by some of the regional standards, so around 12% of GDP in terms of tax revenue. So formalizing different sectors of the economy and improving revenue ahead of LNG is still going to be key. I think also in terms of the debt sustainability picture, while Tanzania has stood apart in the region to some extent because of the lack to some extent of those debt sustainability concerns over the past few years, there's been a bit more focus over the past couple of years on how Tanzania manages the process going forwards in terms of potentially accessing external markets that they've been thinking or talking about Eurobonds for some time. So that the process towards that over the next few years, but also opening their domestic capital market to foreign investors as well. So how they manage that process in a way that doesn't impact the debt sustainability picture going forwards as well is going to be key.
Just
And
tying in on a very important issue that Sarah has raised, it's not just a case of other economies in Africa having perhaps overused the sources of commercial financing that were available to them. But one key factor in many of the debt sustainability, deterioration in debt sustainability instances that seen across the region was when we saw excessive foreign exchange volatility. That often meant that external debt ratios were tipped into the kind of ranges that would just not be considered very sustainable at all. Now, Tanzania has been spared the excessive FX volatility of a lot of its regional partners to some extent, but that has not necessarily happened for the right reason. The concern is that there have been FX liquidity constraints, that supply of FX hasn't always been uniformly available, that in the recent past, that situation has been tight for Tanzania as well. How the authorities manage this challenge of foreign exchange liberalization, allowing for a more traded market, allowing for greater price discovery, allowing for some of those modest depreciation pressures to come through, while keeping inflation low and fairly well contained, is also going to be an important focus for economic policy in the near term.
in a way, could we argue that Tanzania, to some extent, has the benefit of hindsight now, having seen how other African economies have fared in their rush to the international capital markets and the exchange rate volatility that they've seen? Perhaps that gives them at least some insight into how that balancing act might be managed. Okay, so a couple of very quick things, and I mean it's a bit of a big question, but I want to quickly also touch on the mining sector, because we haven't spoken about that. That is, of course, also very important for Tanzania. It's a major gold exporter, but one of the themes that's coming through very quickly across Africa at the moment is this question of critical minerals. Critical minerals, of course, being important to driving the overall global green transition. Where does that fit into the picture in Tanzania? It's also sitting, my understanding is it's also sitting on some considerable reserves of these so-called critical minerals that go into EV batteries and renewable technology in general. Is that something that is worth focusing on in the short term, the medium term? How might that play out?
Yeah, I think that's still a focus in terms of the medium term, not just in terms of harnessing those metals for export, but I think the government has also been looking at how it facilitates and improves the infrastructure to enable exports, not just from Tanzania, but also from some of its neighbours. So we've seen a lot of focus on rail development and also port development as well to enable export of those minerals and other commodities out of Tanzania as well. So I think definitely over the next couple of years, that, and given the transition towards more energy efficient technology as well, that's likely to be a key focus still. But clearly the infrastructure is the near-term focus, I think, in terms of that.
All right, one final question, and then I'll let you go. And this is just on the investment picture in general. Sarah, you mentioned earlier that growth is, yes, of course, you have your big emphasis on the gas sector and the LNG development of the LNG reserves, but you made the point that growth is also kind of being driven quite by diverse sectors, agriculture being one, tourism presumably being one. From an investor standpoint, if you were to just kind of give your quick take on Tanzania, what are some of the opportunities, interesting sectors that you might want to look at if you are, an international investor?
I think there has been a lot of interest in the Tanzania story more broadly because of the growth backdrop. Clearly, if you compare it to global growth, where we're expecting a slight slowdown to about 2.9% this year, Tanzania is growing at around double that rate. So that's been a big driver of that and the reform momentum that we've seen over the past few years. I would say the key focus is likely to be some of those sectors that we've discussed already. So agriculture, trying to reduce import dependence in particular, over the next few years. But also in 2024, I think a sector where we're likely to see more growth is going to be tourism, which we haven't sort of touched on so much recently. Clearly for a lot of the region, the recovery from COVID for the tourism sector has been slightly slower to materialize than it has been in some other regions. I think that's going to be one of the areas where we potentially see a faster growth recovery in 2024. But probably agriculture, mining, construction, all the sectors that we've been discussing likely to be the key focus areas.
One
All right.
underappreciated fact, perhaps, Lanre, is Tanzania's significant demographic potential. So we know that its growth model stands out right now relative to other African peers in that it is fortunate, it's relatively diverse, it's within sight of very, very significant resource wealth from offshore LNG. There are lots of good things, positive things that could coalesce for Tanzania. We shouldn't forget, however, what the demographic outlook for the country is likely to be. There are some studies that have been done suggesting that over the fairly long term, Tanzania could emerge as the fifth most populous country globally. We are talking about a situation several decades away, but for this to be properly harnessed to really add to the growth story of Tanzania, it is going to require a much more inclusive growth model than the economy has seen to date. So Tanzania offers investors significant potential across a number of different sectors, both now and in the medium term. But the challenges that the country faces, how to make that growth more inclusive, how to really lift prospects for the majority of its economy, how to continue to see gains in lifting a significant amount of its population out of poverty, these challenges do persist.
So to wrap this up and maybe summarize the discussion, I would start by saying economic development is hard work, and like any economy, Tanzania obviously faces its challenges, which we've touched upon. But would you say it's fair to say that overall the country is kind of well positioned as long as it has the right approach, the right policies to actually do relatively well in the medium to long term?
Tanzania certainly stands out as one of the likely growth champions, not just of the East Africa region, but across all of Africa over the coming years. Definitely an economy that investors should be focusing on.
All right, Sarah, anything to add?
I think just to echo Razia's points as well, definitely a country that is top of mind, I think, for investors looking into 2024 and beyond.
All right, well, it's a nice positive note to end on. Razia and Sarah, thanks so much for joining the podcast, and thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lanre.